Alrighty guys, happy Sunday to everyone. It's Gus from Pharmacy Down Under. Thanks so much to all of the followers on Instagram for participating with the poll the other week. We went through some really cool case scenarios for legal and ethical questions that you might encounter on a day-to-day in the pharmacy. Today I want to go through those solutions with you and also go through a few other case scenarios that you can see in real life and also that be examined in the pharmacy internship oral exam coming up. Now, it's very important when you're tackling these scenarios that it isn't just sort of a yes and no answer. You have to actually follow a structure. There is a certain criteria that you need to follow in order to get the most amount of marks and hopefully pass those exams. So join me today and let's get started. So if you're not sure what I'm talking about, the other week we had a poll running on our Instagram page, and click in the link in the description to follow. We asked a few questions to all of our audience regarding some legal and ethical scenarios and some quizzes about certain conditions for certain legal and ethical situations in the pharmacy. Now, one of the questions included asking, you have a scenario where you have a patient that has an e-prescription or an e-token for a Schedule 8 medication that has repeats. Now, the question was asking, what are the conditions for storing that repeat? So the options were either the token stays in the pharmacy, or the token can be given back to the patient, or option C, if you're not sure. Now, based on our results for that poll, it was a good 50-50 split. We had half of you guys saying it had to be kept on file and half of you guys saying that the e-token can go back to the patient. Now, in this situation, the token can be given back to the patient if it's an e-script. Now, typically when it comes to Schedule 8 medications, traditionally with the old school handwritten or electronically printed scripts, the repeats do need to be kept in the physical pharmacy that the original script was dispensed at. However, with the introduction of e-scripts, the flexible part about it is that that e-token can go back to the patient if they want to. However, if you like, you can keep it at the chemist as well. So you have both options available, but legally you are allowed to give it back. The second question that we asked was, how often do we need to stock take the Schedule 8 safes? Now, this is a really good one. We had a very divided audience here. We had a lot of people actually say weekly, daily, or biannually. Now, they are all valid, but legally speaking, the minimum is biannually. That's the legal minimum requirement, twice a year. So every pharmacy it will do a stock take in March and a stock take in September on a yearly basis every year. Now, that being said though, on a store-to-store level, each pharmacy can do as many stock takes as required or as necessary, depending on how much DDs they do, how much stock they keep, and the roster of pharmacists on and the hours they operate. They may decide to do it daily, weekly, monthly. Weekly is usually the sweet spot, just they keep track of movement of, medicine coming in, medicine coming out, but at the minimum twice a year. Okay, so the next scenario that we have is a really good one. So a patient returns old, still in date S8 medication that are not needed anymore. Now, what do you do from here? Now, typically when it comes to any sort of Schedule 2, 3, 4 medication, the typical procedure is to put it in the run bin, which is the return unused medicines bin. That gets sealed and then sent off to be incinerated. But when it comes to Schedule 8 medications, it's a little bit more complicated. So the rules differ from state to state, but generally speaking, in New South Wales, the opinion is that when any Schedule 8 medications return to the pharmacy, even if they're not necessarily labeled by your pharmacy or they don't necessarily come to your pharmacy, it's generally the best practice to have them in the safe and at an assigned designated space and entered and registered into the DD book, whether electronically or written, to be later on destroyed by one of yourselves or one of the pharmacists, having a witness as well that's been assigned by the Department of Health. Now, in terms of destroying Schedule 8 medications, there's a few ways to go about it. Depends on the form of the S8, or if it's a patch, or if it's a liquid, or if it's a tablet, or an injection, for example. In most cases, what they will do, the Department of Health will assign either like a policeman or like someone from the community, whether it be like a nurse practitioner or even sometimes even members of council or members of like the local area, just to come and witness you guys do it. It's very casual. Essentially, just to destroy, they've got to have someone to watch you do it, just to make sure that everything's good to go. What's really interesting about this question is that we had actually a unanimous decision on this one, where everyone agreed that it had to be destroyed based off the Department of Health guidelines, which is fantastic. So everyone did really good on that question. Now, the last question was a good one here. This question here is a very realistic scenario that most of you will encounter at some stage in your career. Now, the question's asking, you're a locum pharmacist and you're working in a pharmacy that you've never been to before. However, you have a regular patient that comes into the chemist asking for an owing for a few of their oxycodone tablets. Now, you check their dispensing history and you check their safe script, and their history is consistent and it's safe and there's no signs of misuse or abuse. And what are you meant to be doing in this scenario? So the options here was 4 options. There was 1, dispense the oxycodone owing and wait for a script. 2, reject the owing and provide an alternative. 3, call the doctor and get a phone order. And D, call the pharmacy owner and get their approval. So this is a really interesting one. Now, we've all faced this scenario, and I know the situation is very awkward and it always happens late at night on a Sunday where all medical centers are closed and there's no other opportunity to reach out to anyone. But the decision has to be made, and you need to have some sort of actionable practice or actionable set of procedures in your mind for this kind of scenario, because this is very realistic and will happen to you at some stage. In terms of how you guys went in the poll, it was an interesting one. A lot of you suggested, a majority of you actually, suggested to call the doctor and get a phone order. And some of you even suggested to call the pharmacy owner and get their approval. Now, I see where you're going there, but legally speaking, when it comes to Schedule 8 medications, there is 0 situation specifically for a painkiller Schedule 8 medication where you'd give an owing. No such thing as an emergency supply. There's no such thing as a IOU, not even a half a tablet. Even if their dispensing history is immaculate and they have no history of misuse or abuse, there is no situational scenario where it would warrant it. Because you don't know the patient, it's highly monitored by Medicare, and it's putting you, your registration, and the patient's health at risk. All right, so that was the poll that we ran the other week. But based off that, I want to deep dive into the actual legal and ethical part of the oral exam. Now, it's not really spoken about much, but I think this part of the oral exam is really important because what it does, it really tests your ability to use your brain and tests your ability to problem solve on the spot. Because in real life, you're gonna need to be able to have that decision-making ability, the ability to make, quick, sharp decisions that work out to be the best for you, the patient, and the pharmacy in general. Because these scenarios are something you will encounter on the daily basis, that you will encounter something of that capacity at some stage in your career, either earlier on in your internship, even as a student, or even as a professional, experienced pharmacist. So I think it's worth knowing, even outside of the context of the pharmacy oral exam. Now, when it comes to approaching the actual sort of problem solving, or rather the actual answering for the legal ethical part of the oral exam, my mentality is that you should have a 3-pronged approach. So you should be able to establish straight away what the legal and ethical scenario is, or the problem is. Part 2 would be how would you resolve the situation in this moment? And then part 3 would be how would you rectify this and prevent this from happening again in the future if it was to be a repeated thing. Now, that's the structure I usually hold, and then within that structure, it goes a little bit deeper. We'll go through that in a minute. Now, I think the best way to do it is just to approach it in the actual exam scenario. So I have some here, we'll go through them together. So before we get started with the case scenarios, just for your own reference, in the pharmacy oral exam, the legal and ethical section, which is usually the second part of the oral exam, is only a 5-minute section. So you gotta be short, you gotta be sweet, you gotta be able to train your brain and train your communication skills so that you're not waffling on and getting to the point immediately and getting your answer and delivering your solution as clearly as possible without causing yourself to go over time. Okay. Now, this part of the exam is typically not in a role play. So you don't need to have that communication for doctor or communication with the patient. You don't have to sort of focus on that part of your skill set. This part is just assessing your knowledge of the law, your knowledge of your common sense, and your knowledge about how to get the best solution for everyone without harming the patient, because that's your number 1 priority for all the oral exam and written exam and pharmacy in general. Never harming the patient. That's your number 1 priority, or putting your patient at risk. Now, you only have 5 minutes. It's a closed book section, so there's no notes, there's no external resources you can use. So it's primarily your ability just to problem solve and interpret and analyze the scenario, and putting your mindset in the position of that pharmacist and seeing what are you going to do realistically to solve the problem. So let's get started with the first one together. It's September and you're doing your DD stock count. You work in a large pharmacy and there are 3 saves in the pharmacy. And your preceptor gives you the task of doing the actual stock take for the DD saves. Now, everything looks perfect, everything's fine, there's no discrepancies at all, except for one thing. The OxyContin 20 milligram is missing 2 tablets from the stock on hand. Now, when you mention that to your preceptor asks you to move 2 of those missing tablets into the expired section of your DD book, and then leaving them out from the account for the future stock take for OxyContin. So what are we going to be doing in this situation? So pause the video for a moment and just go through it with yourself, give yourself those 3 dot points of what's the actual legal and ethical problem here, how are you going to rectify it, and how are you going to prevent it from happening again. So in this situation here, it's a very, very particular situation because it actually is something that's very realistic and something that's that you need to understand how to resolve as soon as possible. So just to give you some context, some pharmacies might be running a DD book that might be electronic, and some pharmacies might be running a DD book that is old school hard copy book that has an individual handwritten note about the stock take and the movement of each drug in and out of the chemist. Now, we're just going to assume this is a handwritten copy of the DD book, so it's physical books and written. So essentially what the preceptor is doing is they're suggesting that in order to mitigate actually investigating and digging deeper into the discrepancy in the stock in hand, they want you just to ignore and sort of make a falsified entry in the DD book. So that's the major legal and ethical problem here. That's actually a suspendable offense and can be reported. So it's very, very important to know what that is and the risk of doing something like that. So you're making a forged entry in the DD book, which is illegal. Now, the second part of this is the ethical scenario. So the ethical problem in my mind is that if this preceptor is so comfortable and so easily suggesting to do something illegal like this, what makes me confident that this preceptor hasn't tried to do something like this with previous interns or with other pharmacists with other things in the pharmacy as well? So there's another ethical dilemma that sort of is raised at the top of your brain when you think about this case. So that's the major 2 things. So the actual illegal act or suggesting the illegal act of making a forged entry in the DD book. And the second thing is the actual ethical or the professional legitimacy of this preceptor themselves is another thing that is putting this pharmacy at risk and your internship at risk as well. Now, step 2, what are you going to do in this situation? Ideally, in this situation, it's very, very important to communicate to the marketers as well that you're going to take this preceptor to the side in private and speak to them privately. Very important, the key word is private and not out loud in front of everyone, that you're not comfortable in doing this, that this is sort of breaching the pharmacy laws and pharmacy practice and what it means to be a pharmacist and to work as a pharmacist professionally and legally. And that number 3, that if you're going to get down to the root of this problem, you can work on it together as a team. Go through the stock in hand, try and investigate and find the actual cause of this discrepancy. It could be as simple as a misentry, some sort of lapse in invoicing, something like this. It always ends up being the case. So you can definitely find a solution for sure. It just takes a bit more elbow grease. Other than that, that would be your solution. Very, very important, however, throughout your answer in the oral exam, especially for the legal and ethical part, you need to mention that you're documenting every step of your process. So you're documenting your conversation with the preceptor, you're documenting your process in terms of trying to correct the stock in hand, and then if all else fails, if you fail to find the error of discrepancy and the reason for the discrepancy, the next step would be reporting the discrepancy to the Pharmacy Council or the Department of Health, and they will investigate further and hopefully correct it for you. Now, I'd also suggest when it comes to the legal and ethical scenarios to always mention that you can get in contact with your professional pharmacy indemnity insurance company just to get some legal and professional advice. And that is just a cherry on top that you can add into your case scenario answer. However, realistically speaking, they are actually very, very helpful. So companies like PDL and the like can be instrumental in terms of really giving you that assistance and that comfort and ease that you're doing the right thing. Okay, so that was step 1, we've sorted out. So figuring out what the actual legal and ethical problem was. And step 2 is the actual solution to the problem. So we said we're gonna address the problem head on and say we're not gonna do it. We're gonna find the problem and if not, report it. And step 3, how do you prevent this from happening again in the future? So essentially, the way you're gonna prevent it, the main way is education. It's always gonna be education. So re-educate the pharmacy staff, the professional staff, pharmacists in particular, and those who handle the S8s that they need to be double checking, triple checking, or have some sort of procedure in place in the dispensary to reduce the risk of any stock and hand issues further. Number 2 would be increase the frequency of stock takes. So instead of doing it biannually, they start doing it maybe monthly or fortnightly, just to make sure that we have a smaller time frame to measure from discrepancy to discrepancy. You'll be able to pick up on any changes much faster and less headache overall. And then the third thing as well is just to re-educate the staff about the handling of S8s, from taking the stock from the delivery drivers to the moment you hand it out to the patient. You have a few steps along the way to ensure they're giving out the right strength, right quantity, and right patient. So let's jump into the second scenario. We have a really good scenario where a customer wishes to return 5 boxes of Mixtard pen fill because it was meant to be the Mixtard Flex pen instead. So essentially they received the cartridges of the insulin, but they actually wanted the Flex pen device instead. So the other pharmacist that you're working with checks on the computer, takes them back, puts them back in the fridge, and then corrects it and gives him the correct Mixtard Flex pens in return. Now later on in the day, you notice that that same pharmacist is dispensing a Mixtard pen fill for another patient. Then he goes back into the fridge, picks up that old stock that was returned, and labels it and gives it to the other patient. So what do you do in this situation? So this is another situation where we immediately got to reflect back into that 3-step approach. So step 1, what's the legal problem here? That immediately you can tell straight away that the pharmacist that's dispensing and the Mixtard is actually supplying return medications to another patient, and in particular a fridge line medication, which is extremely wrong. The problem here essentially is that anytime a patient returns a medication to the pharmacy, it needs to be destroyed. There's no ifs or buts about it, especially in the case of a fridge line medicine. So as soon as a medicine that it's in the fridge, whether it be an insulin, it be a vaccine, an eye drop, for example, it leaves the chemist, the stability and the shelf life and the actual quality of the product is out of the window in terms of resellability or the ability to use it safely on another patient. You don't know where they've stored it. You don't know how long it's been out of the fridge for. You don't know the kind of humidity conditions it's been in. I've had situations where people have left insulin in the car overnight, not knowing, and trying to return it back for an exchange for another one. It's just simply it's not how it works. The thing is really important. If the patient is bringing you back supposedly return medications, putting it back in the fridge and resupplying it to another patient not only puts the second patient at risk, but puts the pharmacy at risk in case there's any side effects or any adverse effects down the road. Now, really important though, another situation as well is that the ethical scenario or the ethical problem here is that the other pharmacist that's been doing this exchange and return and giving out to another patient's situation is really questioning the integrity of the safe supply of medications. So the safe supply and safe delivery of medications, specifically fridge temperature or temperature sensitive medicines like insulin to other patients, without really sort of acknowledging the fact that this medicine's been returned, it's been potentially opened, it could be in room temperature for too long. Because keep in mind, when insulin hits room temperature, your expiry drops down to about 4 to 6 weeks, depending on the type of insulin. So you got to be very careful. Now, step 2, what are you going to do about it? So I reckon if in this situation, we're assuming hopefully that the pharmacist is still dispensing, they haven't supplied the medication already. If they haven't supplied the medication already, you need to stop them immediately, take them to the side, tell them, look, this medication I know has been returned. It cannot be given to this next patient. We need to separate that stock, destroy it, and give them a fresh batch from the fridge. Now, you got to explain to them as to why it's wrong, because like we said, the stability is compromised, and we cannot assure that this insulin is going to be the same quality as insulin that's fresh in the fridge and kept between 2 and 8 degrees as recommended. Now, in this situation, we give the patient a fresh batch of Mixtard, we destroy the old batch of Mixtard, and then we need to definitely re-educate the entire staff, especially the pharmacist in particular, about the stability of fridge lines, the procedure in terms of returning medications, whether expired or still in date, and the procedures in terms of exchanges and refunds, which technically aren't allowed for medications. Now, in the situation, if the patient has already received the medications, this sort of changes it up a bit. So the answer would still be all the same. The only difference is that you need to contact the patient immediately and tell them to come back and get a new set of Mixtard in replacement for the one they received. And on top of this as well, we need to confirm whether or not the patients have used it. And if they have used it, we need to report it just in case to PDL. I would report it either way. if they'd used it or not, just to cover yourself and to make sure that you're documenting this whole process as well, just to cover yourself in case there is a misadventure or some sort of adverse effects, which we don't want, but can happen. Now, step 3 is what do you do now from here, or how do you prevent this from happening again? Now, essentially the whole idea here is that you need to make sure education is number 1. So education, documentation, and reciprocation. So educate all the staff on the actual procedures for returning medicines, specifically fridge line medicines. Educating the pharmacist on how to handle fridge line medications again, and also having procedures in place in dispensary, whether it be a table or some sort of flow chart or some sort of poster just stuck in the dispensary, maybe the in-counter, when they interact with the majority of patients about the step-by-step procedure on what to do and how to not replicate this problem again. Another thing as well is to make sure you're documenting this whole situation as well, either in the patient's dispensing history, in your own notes, something like this, as long as you have some sort of date or some sort of time, some sort of name associated, so you can reflect back in case there is a claim made. You can always reflect back to your documents as well. All right, now we have a final case. So the last case is a little bit of an interesting one. So essentially, you've just purchased a brand new pharmacy, and essentially you're doing some renovations and you're sort of reorganizing the dispensary and trying to make it sort of how you envisioned. Now, one thing you noticed is that you do have some areas that are assigned for the old claims for the previous pharmacy that was before you. Now, one of your dispensary technicians suggests that you should just chuck them out and get rid of them so you can make room for more dispensary shelf space. So what do you do in this situation? Looking at it a little bit deeper, we need to understand that there are rules when it comes to the storage of claims for scripts. So there's 2 different rules, and this is New South Wales rules. Now, for regular S4s, generally speaking, the claims or the actual duplicates, whether it be the concessions or the generals or the repat or safety net, even privates as well, all need to be stored away for 2 years from that day. Now, when it comes to Schedule 8 medications, it's typically 3 years, and they need to be separated away from everything else as well. So in their own, separate file. Now, depending on the date of these scripts that are in this dispensary at the moment, we need to figure out if they're more than 2 years old, we can dispose of them. They can be sent off to a confidential sort of shredding company that can sort of shred and destroy that kind of documents. However, if it's less than 2 years old, then they need to be kept in the pharmacy until the 2-year mark has elapsed, and only then it can be shipped off and destroyed. All right, so we went through a few cases together. It's quite a long one, that's okay. The thing is, in the real life scenarios, you're gonna face things like this on a regular basis, but it's super important that you keep this in the back of your mind, that 3-pronged approach. Figuring out what the actual legal ethical problem is, figuring out what are you going to do immediately to help the patient, help the pharmacy and yourself as well in terms of what's safe and what's legal. And step 3 is figuring out how to prevent this from happening again in the future. Okay, so that goes for the oral exam, and that also goes for real life as well. So just bear that in mind. I know it's quite intense, and if you're feeling a bit apprehensive about it, please shoot me a DM on Instagram or LinkedIn. By all means, I'm more than happy to sit down and have a chat with you. Otherwise, make sure you're subscribing to the page. Make sure you're following our Instagram page. We're putting up weekly quizzes on there and really trying to get you guys to get those cogs going in the brain before the actual exam comes around to get yourselves in the mindset, all right? So if you liked the video, please let me know. Just give us a like, give us a comment, subscribe if you want to learn more, and share it around. Thanks so much, guys. Have a great one. Bye.